Welcome back to my series on chess opening theory. In this video, I'm going to be looking at the move 7 h4 variation in the Winawer main line of the French defense. So the French defense is when we have the moves e4, e6, d4, d5, and the Winawer begins after the moves knight to c3, bishop to b4, and then here the move by white, pawn to e5, is by far the most popular move, and I personally like the main line, which involves black playing pawn to c5, and then white will very often play pawn to a3, black takes, white takes, black can now play knight to e7, and we have reached, an important tabia in the Winawer. And so, there are four main moves that white will play these days. We have looked at queen to g4 a bit. We have looked at knight to f3, and today, in this video, we will look at the move pawn to h4. So already we see that the Lichess engine, like the Lichess browser engine, isn't crazy about this move, but the more modern engines, the stronger engines, they actually like this move. It's kind of a trendy move these days. We're seeing it a lot more in recent games. And as a result, it is a move that doesn't have a whole lot of games in the database. There is a decent number. And the theory, it still hasn't been fully developed. Like players, they are still trying stuff out. So as a result, I thought that I would show a very recent and relevant game, a game from a candidates tournament. And so in this position, there are a number of moves that black can now play. But I personally like... I just like queen to c7. I think this is a fine move. Just developing the queen and threatening some potential tactics involving taking here and putting the queen on c3, stuff like that. And one thing that actually really confuses me about this line, like one thing that I was looking at when researching this video, is that after the move pawn to h5, which is the most critical move, like if white plays knight to f3, then black can actually kind of just transpose to the knight f3 line by playing pawn to b6, and then we will kind of have a similar game as the one we saw in the previous video. But one thing that does actually quite confuse me quite a bit is that in this position, like in this critical position here, if when white plays pawn to h5, black almost universally, almost always plays pawn to h6. But given that this is a line where a lot of French defense players, they're trying to find new ideas, they're trying to find ways to deal with h4, with this pawn coming down the board, with white striking on the king side like this. One thing that really confuses me is why doesn't black just play c takes d4? Like, I looked at the database, I turned on the browser engine, and I'm just confused. This looks completely fine. And this has been played a few times before, and the results have generally been very good for black. Like white wins 23% of games. The 41% of games are drawn, and then 36% of games featuring this line in the Lichess Masters database are won by black. So I don't really get why, this move hasn't really been considered. It isn't really even discussed in, Grandmaster Guiry's course on the French. And so, yeah, it just confuses me. Like, it looks a little scary. It looks like, oh, maybe white can do this. And it's like, nah, there's nothing for white here. Black can just take, and then if white tries this, you just take like this, give this check, and then take the pawn. And everything's good, and if white plays accurately, like if white plays the moves suggested by the browser engine, for example, just taking, and black can give this check, hitting the king and the rook, so white cannot block with the queen. White also doesn't want to move their king. Bishop d2 is more or less forced. And then queen takes d4. This looks totally fine. Like if we turn on the engine, for example, like it's plus 0.3. Like, why have so few games featured this? I am so confused. Like, the engine like basically says white has a slight advantage, but only if white plays really accurately and stuff. And then, just check like this. Bishop e2, just develop, cover this square a bit, stuff like that. King f1 has been played a couple of times, b6. Bishop b5 check. Knight d7. King g1, h6. Black is fine here. So if you look at the game that we have today and you don't like what black did, then I would recommend looking into this really weird alternative that I kind of found by accident. Like trying that out and seeing, is it actually playable, since, it looks interesting. But instead, after pawn to h5 on move 8, instead of doing this c takes d4, c takes d4, queen c3 check stuff, black can just go for pawn to h6. Like, this is like much more popular, like much more mainstream. Like, part of the idea is to just stop this pawn from moving. Like this, kind of maneuver with the pawns like this by white. It's very often seen in other lines, such as the a3 c4 middle game of the advanced variation. And now in this position, white very often is like, oh snap, I've got to deal with this problem. I've got to deal with this kind of stuff. So there are a number of ways that white might deal with that. For example, by playing bishop to d2, stuff like that. But lately, rook b1 has been more popular, since very often this bishop wants to be on some other square. It wants to be participating in some other way. So to put it on d2 and then to have to move it again, that's not so fun. And then here in this position, there aren't that many games in the database, but this is kind of new and trendy and stuff. This position occurred at the candidates. So in the game, black played the move pawn to b6 with a number of ideas, adding some defense to this pawn, potentially putting the bishop on a6 to try to trade for this guy over here, since white has the two bishops. But Grandmaster Giri actually recommends a different move in his course, and that move is knight b c6, kind of just developing and adding a bit more pressure over here as well, and as well as over here. And then basically the position becomes kind of like the a3 c4 middle game. Like, black can try to castle, play b6, put the knight on a5 to stop this pawn from ever coming down the board, or like coming down to a5, I should say. Do things like that, add and just have a pleasant position, like break on the king side at some point in the future, probably after getting the king to safety, to avoid any nasty tactics. S6, but if white tries a much more critical line like queen g4, black can play rook g8, and then if bishop d3, pawn to c4, it looks like white can come in here like this, but in reality it doesn't really work, since there's ideas of this sacrifice with the knight, right? And let's see, if white takes, for example, we'll have this queen check, and then if knight e2, then rook at h7, just picking up the bishop. The bishop has no good squares to go. Oh, like stuff like that. One thing I forgot to cover in my analysis real quick, just take a look at it now, is what happens if white instead just retreats the queen while still putting pressure on the pawn. I think, let's see, I should just let the engine tell me what the move is. Okay, apparently the move is to play like this, knight d3 check, and then if takes, and then rook here, and the bishop is trapped. Okay, so that's the idea. All right. Hey, so similar stuff, but that is not what happened in the game. Instead of playing Grandmaster Giri's recommendation, which is knight bc6 here, instead black went for pawn to b6 with ideas of maybe trading the bishop like this and solidifying this pawn, and also dealing with the fact that the rook is kind of eyeing the b7 pawn, stuff like that. So pawn to b6 is a fine move. There's nothing wrong with it. I think it's a decent choice. It's just that if you look at this game and you kind of want something else, well, there are other choices that black can play too. So that's why I talked a bit about that. So in the game, white now played queen g4. And I think before continuing, I should introduce the players. So with the white pieces, we have Grandmaster Fabiano Caruana, who is an Italian-American super grandmaster. He has actually played under the flags of both Italy and the United States. Like, he has changed federations a couple of times. And he has won on big tournaments such as the Italian Chess Championship multiple times, the Sinkfield Cup, and probably most notably the 2018 Candidates Tournament, where he earned the right to challenge Magnus Carlsen for his World Championship title, and then in that match he did very well. All 12 games were drawn, which, is still pretty impressive. Like, the World Championship match was decided by tiebreak. It's kind of weird for the classical chess world champion to be decided using some rapid games, but hey, that's another matter. That's outside the scope of this video. And in terms of playing style, Grandmaster Caruana is known for very strong opening preparation. Like, very often when you're learning an opening and you're going into very critical lines, one thing that you'll often want to do is you'll often want to see, what does Caruana play against my opening? How do I deal with, Grandmaster Caruana's past preparation? And so he's very known for his very strong opening prep. And he's also known for being very solid, which for me is kind of a dirty word. I don't like being very solid, but that's kind of a playing style thing. And as a result, he is very hard to beat, but if Grandmaster Caruana ever played against me, I would most likely lose on time because I would fall asleep while my clock is running. And so anyway, with the black pieces, we have Grandmaster Jan Nepomniachtchi, who is the current, one of the current challengers for the World Championship title, since unfortunately Magnus Carlsen is not defending it. And he has also won the Candidates Tournament in the past. He won it twice, and he's also come in second in World Blitz and World Rapid and Fisher Random as well, if I recall correctly. And Grandmaster Nepomniachtchi, his playing style is much more what I like. Like, his style is a lot more dynamic than solid, and that can lead to some very fun and exciting positions, even if it does mean taking on more risk. And this game, it was played at the Candidates tournaments that took place in both 2020 as well as 2021, because it occurred during the pandemic. Like, when the pandemic occurred, the tournament had to be postponed to 2021, and Grandmaster Nepomniachtchi actually won this tournament. And more information about the players and the event can be found in the video description. And now back to the game. So white has now played queen to g4, or attacking this guy over here. And black now goes for c takes d4, counter-attacking in the center. White plays queen takes g7, taking a pawn of their own and attacking the rook. Black plays rook to g8. We have queen takes h6, queen takes e5 check, knight to e2, d takes c3. If we count the pawns, I believe that black is now currently up 1 pawn. Yep, that is correct. Like, that's one thing I often have to double check because I am apparently bad at counting, as you've probably seen in some of my past videos. Anyway, in this position, black has some very strong control of the center, and black's pieces are quite a bit more active than white's. In particular, this pin on white's knight is very annoying. It makes it hard for white to get their bishop into the game, stuff like that. But white does have this very nice passed pawn that is pretty far advanced down the board. So white probably wants to go for an endgame, and we see white's next move is queen to f4. White wants to trade queens. It makes a lot of sense. Like, white's queen is kind of oddly placed on h6, whereas black's queen is strong and centralized. So we have this trade. White develops with tempo, like by taking back. Black plays knight b c6. Next, we have knight takes c3. The pawn count is now the same, but black still has strong control of the center. Black plays e5. We have bishop to e2, bishop to f5, putting the bishop on, this diagonal over here, where it can perhaps guard this square as this pawn is coming down the board. We have pawn to f3, kind of stopping this pawn from coming forward, perhaps. And now black activates their remaining piece. They activates the rook. But black doesn't necessarily need to castle here, as the king is fairly safe, and black probably does not want to be taking their king away from this side of the board because the king might be needed to stop this pawn. We have king to f2, pawn to f6, just adding some defense to this pawn, also freeing up the f7 square for the king. We have bishop to d3. The engine doesn't really like this move, but it's kind of unclear as to why. It's not because it gives black the chance to trade bishops and get rid of the bishop pair. Like, the engine actually thinks that white is slightly better if that does occur. Like, we'll have bishop takes, c takes, and king f7 just to get closer to here. Knight to e2 just to re-coordinate. Knight to f5. I have rook bc1, putting the rook on a better file since it can't really do much against this. Rook to c8, and then if we turn on the engine says it's almost +1, so white is kind of playing for a win here. But so it's not because of the bishop trade. Like, the bishop trade would actually be good for white because it would take away a defender of this important square. Like, black would be left with short range pieces that kind of get distracted over here, and white might be able to strike on the other side of the board, stuff like that. But so what's interesting is the engine also doesn't really like black's next move with king to f7. The engine instead wants black to kind of go for pawn to e4, which is pretty sharp, like, pretty interesting move. Like, I don't think that, white can't really take back, because if, for example, pawn takes, and then pawn takes, I should double check this, but I think white is just losing a piece here. Okay, so yeah, white can't really take back if black plays pawn to e4 and essentially retains control of this. Game might continue with bishop to b5, for example, and then, ooh, that's interesting. That's a really interesting idea, actually. Pawn to e3 check, and then something takes over here. Bishop takes is significantly better. Better pawn to here. Okay, that would actually be an interesting approach, but this is not what happened in the game. Basically, trading a couple of pawns for one of white's pieces. Pretty cool. But that's not what happened in the game. I guess both players missed that. We have king to f7, pawn to g4, bishop takes d3, c takes d3. The trade was more or less forced. Like, basically, black does not want to surrender control of this square over here or to white's light square bishop. So basically, if black's bishop has to be kicked away, it might as well take white's bishop down with it. we have knight to d4, putting the knight on a more active square. And then rook hc1. Interesting move, but it does kind of make sense. The rook doesn't need to stay behind this pawn, as the pawn is now well defended by the g4 pawn over here. So white can just kind of keep this pawn sitting here and push it at the right time. We have rook to c8, fighting for control of this file. We have knight to e2. The engine doesn't like this too much. The knight was actually kind of well placed on c3, and maybe it could actually eventually come to b5 or something if this knight gets kicked away. The engine instead wanted bishop to e3, and then this knight kind of has to move. Or maybe, I guess... No, yeah, the knight has to move, because knight to c6, like knight c6 would be met by knight takes pawn. And then this knight could maybe get to b5 and be more active this way. But that's not what happened in the game. Instead, we have knight to e2. Knight to e6 anyway. Knight goes back to c3. I guess kind of offering a repetition, or maybe... what's it called? Maybe, change... White realized that, oh, there actually is something I can do instead. Like, part of the idea of knight to e2, like, it's not a completely illogical move. Part of the idea might have been to prepare this, although that's still a little slow because, this guy still needs to be defended somehow. So it's a bit of a strange move still. But anyway, we have knight to e6. Knight goes back to c3. Black decides to make a break with pawn to f5. I've tried to weaken this pawn a little, stuff like that. What's interesting, actually, is after this move here, I think that's what black would now do, is black doesn't have to take this pawn. Black can actually play a move like perhaps knight to d4. Let's see what the engine says. Oh, actually, black can take. Taking is fine. And then if knight takes... Knight c5, and black probably has strong enough pieces as compensation for the sacrificed pawn. So, yeah, okay. Still very equal position, but this is not what happened in the game. Instead, after f5, white did not take like this. White played knight to b5. We have rook takes c1, rook takes c1, fg4, rook g1, gf3, and then here in this position, the engine actually doesn't like that white played the move knight to d6 check, and I do kind of agree. Knight to d6 check is a little strange because even though it does put the knight on an active square, it does take the knight away from this square where it's potentially able to win this pawn. Like, what the engine wants is rook takes g8, knight takes g8, king takes f3, and then apparently after knight to f6, knight to here, knight d4 check, king to f2, knight takes h5. But this is still somewhat drawish over here. So maybe white didn't like this and wanted to go for something else. We have knight d6 check, king to f6, rook takes g8, knight takes, and then king takes f3, knight d4 check, and the engine wanted white to advance with king to g4, or like piece activity is very often quite important in endgames in particular. But instead we have king to f2, and then black played king to e6. We have knight to e8. Knight is probably trying to get to like c7. We have knight to f6. Engine's not too crazy about this. We have pawn to h6, going for some sneaky stuff of trying to, if black takes like this, there's h7, h8, and here in this position, let's see, here, black had a bit of a missed opportunity. Like black instead played knight to f5, just applying some pressure to the pawn, but apparently king to f7 is quite good. Right. And then if knight d6 check, okay, the engine's being silly. Repeating moves is not an advantage, you silly engine. Anyway, in this position, black just played knight to f5, bringing the knight back to help defend against nasty pawn. Pawn that is still a thorn in black's side. Black might be getting ready to gang up on it. It's with maybe the knight and the king. Or knight and the king, I should say. Whoops. And anyway, we have knight to f5 in this position. We now have king to e2. Ooh, apparently the engine prefers knight to c7 check, probably trying to distract the king away from the pawn, but I don't really see much point behind it. Knight c7 check, king here, knight here, king down here, knight c7. Engine is being weird and unreliable. Let's just enjoy the game. So we have king to e2, king to f7, knight to c7 now, king to g6, ganging up on the pawn. We have pawn to h7, king takes h7, keeping these knights, closer into the game, letting the king be the one to run around. For one thing, black probably wants to keep this pawn defended from this knight. Anyway, we have bishop to g5, knight to d4 check. White has to watch for forks, no playing king to here or here, otherwise, whoopsies. We have king to g6 now, bishop takes f6, king takes f6, knight takes d5 check, king to e6, knight to c3, b5, king to d2, a5, advancing the majority, trying to do something with these pawns. Black is currently up a pawn. Black is currently the only one who can really win now. Knight to e4, king to d5, king to c3, knight to e2 check, king to d2, knight to f4, knight to g5, knight to e6. The king and pawn endgame would actually be winning for black, so black would be happy with a trade here. I should just double check that I'm not misleading you, but yeah, it would be completely winning for black. Anyway, that's not what happened in the game, thankfully. Knight to e4, knight to c5, knight c3 check, king c6, knight to e2, knight to e6, knight to c3. The game has kind of gotten a bit boring. It's kind of lost a lot of life. There isn't a whole lot to try left for black. Like, black's trying to get this pawn down the board, but it's going to be very hard. Or even practically speaking, it's tricky to actually make any progress. White can basically just hold. So black's just trying to get in, trying to do something. You know that the line is decent when we reach a position like this. When we reach a position where only black is the one who's really able to play for a win. Anyway, knight e1 check, king d2, knight to g2, king c2, knight e3 check. I don't think this inaccuracy matters. I don't even really consider this an inaccuracy. The position just looked like a draw already. King b3, king to b5, knight to d7. How will black defend this pawn? Only one way, knight g4, king c2, king to c6, knight to b8 check, king to c5, king to b3, king to d4, knight c6 check, king takes d3, knight takes e5 check, knight takes, king takes b4, and the game is a complete draw here due to insufficient material. It is impossible for either player to deliver checkmate. You cannot checkmate with just king and knight against king. And overall, I would say this was a pretty cool game, a pretty interesting game, even if it eventually did kind of get to a point where like even though the end game might not have been all that interesting, it is still kind of interesting to see that Black is not really dead in this line, and that there is still a lot of unexplored territory, a lot of new ideas to try. Like if you looked at this game and were thinking, oh, I really don't like how this game turned out. This looks way too boring. I don't really like these kind of end games, stuff like that. Then, well, at least there are some nice alternatives to consider instead. That will be all for now. Until next time, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe.